Welcome to Reinvent and the series Reinvent American Foreign Policy. I'm Pete Leiden. I'm the founder of Reinvent, and I'm going to help moderate this conversation a little bit behind the scenes today. Now, today we're going to talk about the most important foreign policy issue that most people have never heard of. This is the idea of to what extent should the United States invest what could be roughly $1 trillion in modernizing our nuclear weapons systems, which is the so-called triad, which are intercontinental ballistic missiles, nuclear bombers, and nuclear submarines. Now, it's been 70 years since the United States did usher in the nuclear age, and since that time, it actually started off the arms race with the Soviet Union, among others. And so in the wake of that, there was a huge build-out of all three dimensions of that triad. And over time, that was thought of as a way to actually deter a first strike and also to figure out a way to kind of keep a nuclear balance, which frankly has been maintained for the last 70 years. However, these systems now are aging. And in fact, they're also potentially, some of them are getting to the point where that aging could actually even get to safety concerns as these things start to break down. And so the Obama administration is contemplating right now whether we're going to reinvest in the next generation of all three of these weapons systems for the next century here. And this is the $1 trillion kind of idea that we've just mentioned a second ago. So it seems like a great time, a good point to just, at this situation, to step back and think, okay, do we really need to do this? What would we really need to do to keep Americans safe in this kind of nuclear context? And also, could we even take advantage of this opportunity to actually disarm more and actually to move closer towards a world where we're not having nuclear weapons? These are the kind of questions that, in fact, are asked by a Plowshares Fund, which is our partners in this series, and it's also a real deep concern with three of the individuals who have been supporting this effort, which is Guy Saperstein, Dan Berger, and Katrina van der Heuvel. All three of them, we thank them for their backing on this, and we are really grateful, though, today to have Jim Walsh leading us in this conversation. And Jim is an international security expert, you could say, particularly specializing in nuclear weapons and terrorism. He is currently a research associate at MIT's a program there on security studies. And he previously was the executive director of a program at Harvard's Kennedy School, the Kennedy School, actually, in the same kind of area. The other thing about Jim, which is great, is he's a communicator to broader audiences. He's testified before Congress on various issues. He's been on something close to 1,000 times on television to kind of talk about these issues, and he's also a regular contributor to public radio. So it's great to have Jim here, and great to have you here. But before we go to Jim, we're going to go around the table and introduce all the other folks who are going to add to the conversation today. And the first one we're going to do is Andrew Weber, who's a former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear, Chemical, and Biological Defense Programs. And so, Andy, do you want to talk a little bit about your background and what you bring to the table?
Hi. Yes, I served in the federal government for 30 years, retired this summer. My last big assignment was as President Obama's Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear, Chemical, and Biological Defense Programs. And in that capacity, I was director of the Nuclear Weapons Council, which makes, together with the Department of Energy, it makes these types of big investment decisions. What is the nuclear stockpile the United States needs today and tomorrow?
Thank you, Andrew. The next we actually have is coming in from Japan. We've got Christine Parthemore. She's an International Affairs Fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations, and she wins the award for coming the furthest for this conversation, like I say, all the way in from Japan. Christine, tell us a little bit more about your background.
Hi, thanks for having me. From 2011 to 2014, I was a senior advisor to the Assistant Secretary for Nuclear, Chemical, and Biological Defense Programs, so advised Andy and then his successor on everything he just said. More recently, since leaving the government, I've been focusing on extended deterrence and how other countries might react or view U.S. moves to make further reductions in its nuclear forces.
Good to have you in here. We also got The next up is going to be Erika Thoughts, Nuclear Weapons Policy Director at the Women's Action for New Directions, or WAN. Erika, tell us a little bit about your background.
Hi, thank you so much for having me today. Thank you to Reinvent, and thank you so much to everybody on the panel. I'm really honored to be speaking with you. I do WAN's nuclear weapons policy, and a little background on WAN. We have been focused on nuclear disarmament since the early 80s. Currently, I think about just the topic that we are focusing on today: affordability, feasibility, practicality, and the security aspects of our nuclear modernization program, and work with Congress and the grassroots on this endeavor. And I started thinking about these issues more broadly when I was in graduate school a couple of years ago. Prior to that, I was a staffer on Capitol Hill.
Good to have you. Thanks for coming. And we got Gregg Caryn, Policy Analyst at the Center for Arms Control and Nonproliferation.
Peter, thanks for having me. It's great to see a distinguished panel. Some friends I've worked with several times before, some I look forward to working with in the future. I am a policy analyst at the Center for Arms Control and Nonproliferation. So I work on nuclear nonproliferation issues, I work on nuclear terrorism, U.S. nuclear strategy, defense budget issues, which all kind of come together in the conversation we're having today. Before I was policy analyst, I actually got my start as a Scoville Fellow, which brings young undergraduates and graduate students after their degrees to come and work on nuclear issues and peace and security issues at think tanks around D.C. It's a great chance for those of you at home who are watching and want to get involved in these issues to get on board. I look forward to the conversation.
Good to have you here, too. Okay, this is great. As great as this group is here, you know there's folks out there that know just as much. And so we do encourage people to actually add comments on our site or any place you're seeing this stream, or you can use the hashtag Reinvent on Twitter, and we keep an eye on all that, too. So let's swing back to Jim. And Jim, why don't you kind of tee up this issue? You're an insider, but you also have a way of kind of explaining it to outside groups. And tell us what's at issue here.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks to all of you who have tuned in for this. It is a distinguished and great panel. It's my honor to be here. Let me set the table by asking a couple of questions. One, what's the goal here? What are we trying to do in this conversation? And I think we're trying to balance two different things. As Peter suggested, we want to have some fresh thinking, not be afraid of the big ideas, and also balance that against something that has to be decided in the near-term horizon. The U.S. may make decisions about its nuclear arsenal that will have carry-on consequences for decades to come. So we want to attack what is before us, but also keep our minds open as we consider the future. Why are we having this conversation now? As Peter suggested, we're at a pivot point. Those systems are showing their age. There are going to have to be decisions made over the next several years about what to do about that, and those decisions will have consequences for the future. And we shouldn't just do it out of habit or on autopilot. I think we really need to engage this and engage it now in a strong way. Where are we right now? Where do we stand as we have to consider these decisions? Well, in the world today, there are roughly 16,000 nuclear warheads or nuclear weapons. The U.S. and Russia have over 90% of that, 93% to be exact. And of course, we spend a lot more than everyone else combined. And we're talking about an arsenal that's composed both of bombs and missiles, that is to say bombs that are dropped from planes, and then missiles that are fired from silos deep underground in North Dakota or elsewhere in the United States, or from submarines at sea. And what we'll be talking about is what makes sense going forward. Does it make sense to have all three kinds? Does it make sense to simply extend what we have, or as some have proposed, to actually add to their capabilities, and what would be the implications of changing that mix and changing the capabilities that we have? So finally, what is being proposed here? There's been a proposal to modernize and that the arsenal, and that modernization is not simply, again, life extension, but rather, in some cases, adding new capabilities that we have not had before, new weapons systems we have not had before. So we're talking about a next-generation strategic bomber, and in fact, a bomber that might be armed with cruise missiles rather than simply gravity bombs, so that it could sort of hover off the Soviet Union, or we call it the Soviet Union. That shows you a little legacy issue there. Stay outside of Russian air defenses and fire its cruise missiles. We're talking about building a new generation of nuclear submarines and expanding that number, as well as upgrading our land-based missiles, which are called ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. And I promise you we'll try as hard as we can not to overload you with acronyms, but it's an addictive thing in this business. And then we're talking about modernizing the bombs themselves, and as I said, developing a brand new nuclear cruise missile. That's what's being proposed. The question is, does it make sense? Will it create a safer world or a more dangerous world? And how does it fit with our long-term objectives? And so at the suggestion of folks who organize this, we're going to do a little thought experiment here. We're going to ask ourselves, rather than getting right into a debate about we should cut this or expand that, why don't we start with first principles and ask ourselves, if we were starting from scratch today, what's the sort of force that we would build? What are the objectives we want to achieve with that force? What would that force look like? And then when we figure that out, then it makes sense to think about how we want to go forward. So I want this panel, anyone on this panel, to begin and maybe talk a little bit about what these weapons are for and what we're trying to accomplish with them.
I like the way you frame this, is starting with what principles should guide us if we were to start from scratch. And there are a handful of them that I think are really important and that really do help us think about what we should do now with our modernization efforts and our investments. Some of the ones that are dear to me, and then we can turn to some of my friends here to see their ideas. One is that it should actually achieve deterrence. So that's what they're there for. We want to think about them as a deterrent force, not a war-fighting force. So achieving deterrence is sort of a first principle. One of the ones that I keep in mind in thinking about our new investments, and definitely about these questions being raised about whether to expand our capabilities, is that I think our investments should be careful to avoid lowering the threshold of use. So this is, if you look at Pakistan, for example, and all of the international communities, very deep concerns about their investment in tactical nuclear weapons. I think it shows the concerns that come about from investing in those types of weapons, particularly because they lower the threshold of use. They're seen by their advocates as being easier to employ by a head of state and easier to make the decision to use. I think avoiding that is a really important first principle that we should keep in mind if we were to start from scratch. Another one that I would keep in mind is that our investments should align with our own policies. Part of achieving effective deterrence is making sure that we're credible to the international community, and of course the international community then gets a vote in that. So if our investments are seen by other countries as being misaligned to our own policies, such as, for example, right now with our nuclear posture review, states that we're trying to lower the focus on nuclear weapons and strategy and instead favor conventional alternatives. So our nuclear investments need to align to that type of policy, and they need to be seen by the international community as doing as such.
That sounds good. That's a great start. Greg, do you have things to add to that?
Yeah, in addition to everything that Christine just said, which I couldn't be more on board with, I'm just thinking about this question a little bit earlier and what we would actually create if we could create this dream arsenal scenario without having to deal with both domestic and international politics. Some of the qualities I would look for in the new arsenal would be, it'd be smaller than our current one. We've got nearly 5,000 weapons, both deployed and on reserve. I'd go for maybe 1,000. And that's not totally off base. We saw a report in 2012 that was then Senator, but soon to be Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel, Ambassador Pickering, the Vice Chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Cartwright. So big policy thinkers saying that we could do deterrence with 900 total nuclear weapons on bombers and subs. So I'd go smaller than what we have. I'd also, and this might be getting a little bit technical, but I'd trim the hedge. And what that means is we currently have almost a 2-to-1 proportion where for every one deployed weapon we have 2 reserve weapons, and that's pretty excessive. So what I would look for is maybe a 1-to-1 parity. So if you have 1,000 weapons, 500 on deployment, 500 in reserve. Also looking at the triad, I'm not so sure I would keep the ICBM. It has some drawbacks. For starters, the fixed flight path means it's flying over Russia, which has problems if you're trying to target other countries, and you can accidentally start a nuclear war. Not like you're not trying already if you're launching an ICBM, but you also have issues with vulnerability and launch on warning. So if you have a ICBM and it's fixed, you have a matter of minutes to decide whether you want to launch it on attack, and that is a very small window for making the right decision to avoid nuclear war. So I would probably remove the ICBM. I'll let Andy talk more about the cruise missile because I know that's something he really enjoys talking about. But the smaller, fixing the hedge and removing the launch on warning, I think were three big things I'd want in the new nuclear arsenal.
Well, I think already we have some great ideas. And I should probably step back and think a little bit about what's our objective here. I'm going to use an absolutely awful analogy to try to communicate one of the things we're struggling with. You know, some folks buy a firearm, buy a handgun, and they keep it at their home in order to protect themselves, to be safe. And the problem, of course, is that it might accomplish that, but then there are risks to having that gun in your home, accidental usage or a child gets shot and that sort of thing. And we sort of face that with nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons can help make us safer by deterring an attack by an adversary, but by having the nuclear weapons, they introduce their own dangers too. Accidental use, mistakes, misperception. And so I think the goal of this conversation in part is to try to say, well, what's the arsenal we have that would make us the most safe? All these configurations and mixes, they're going to have their advantages and disadvantages, and there's no eliminating risk, right? We all live in a world of risk. Nothing is perfect. But I think our objective should probably be to have an arsenal that fits some of the characteristics that we've already discussed: ability to deter, ability to reassure our allies, and some of those characteristics, but also be equally attentive to the risks of the weapons themselves. We don't want to end up making ourselves less safe as we strive to try to deter an attack from others. So I think we have to weigh these different things. And so, as the others have pointed out, deterrence, reassuring allies, reliability. We want to make sure that the weapons perform the way we want them to, and that there aren't problems that they go off when they shouldn't. And we want to be able to control those weapons. We want something that's fiscally responsible, that isn't going to bankrupt us. Great powers in history more often than not have lost their status because of economic problems, not a lack of weapons. So we want to be fiscally responsible. But I'd like to throw out another one for the panel to consider, and that is something that we want an arsenal that's institutionally and technically resilient. Our arsenal now is 70 years old, and it's showing technical wear and tear, but it's also showing institutional wear and tear, particularly the land-based missiles. We had a story in the paper this week of a missile being repaired, and then there was a problem and an accident, and there's been, unfortunately, scandal after scandal, normally involving low morale or cheating or other sorts of things for these poor folks who are up in North Dakota, Wyoming, and elsewhere who have to manage our land-based missiles. So as we try to get the principles right on deterrence, and as we try to get the technology right, we also have to have institutions that can manage these in a responsible and safe way. So those are some of the things that I'm thinking about as I think about the sort of force we want to have in the future.
So if I could just jump in there, Jim, thinking about that commentary that when we have things that seem to be breaking down, we fix them. There are a couple examples of that in the past. There was an instance in which a wrench was dropped down a silo. It detonated a missile, and it actually flew off and damaged, I think it killed a couple people, in fact. And as a result, we stopped using liquid fuel. And then we had another instance in which a bomb broke up over, I believe it was North Carolina, and dropped a live nuclear weapon on North Carolina. Luckily, it didn't detonate. I think 9 out of 10 of the fail-safes failed, but 1 survived, and that's why we still have 50 states. But after that, we stopped flying live alerts. And so we've taken these instances in which we've made mistakes or where the institutions have failed us, and we've changed them. I think you raise a good point that we should be comfortable doing that in the future, and doing that now to address maybe these low morale problems, and also if the ICBMs themselves, the silos, are running out of their usefulness.
Christine, what's your take on some of this? We've put a lot of stuff on the table here, what our objective is, and then some of the characteristics. You mentioned deterrence and reassurance. How do you respond to some of this?
Yeah, I definitely agree in terms of a lot of these standards and the importance of reducing the risks of miscalculation and accidents happening, that the ICBMs, our land-based leg of the triad, is the weakest link. So reducing the numbers there and figuring out ways that we can smartly reduce the risks involved with that is really important. And that's partly a force structure question, but you're right that it's partly a policy and practices question as well. So it gets to how we train and how we keep the morale up within our forces. And I know the Department of Defense is working really hard on trying to figure out how to get morale back up among the forces that guard the ICBMs in particular. But it also gets to our policies with international partners. So building confidence building measures and hotlines to try and avoid accidents with other nuclear countries and things like that are a really important part of it, in addition to any force structure changes that we could bring that would reduce risks on our end as well. On the positive side, two of the things that I would add to the sort of principles if we were to start from scratch, one would be flexibility, and another would be maintaining our ability to signal without actually having to release a nuclear weapon, I think are really important. So both of those speak mostly to our sea-based and bomber legs of our triad, though. So our subs are very flexible, they're very survivable. We can put them all over the world. It's a really, really great asset in terms of having a survivable and useful nuclear asset on our hand. For the air leg of the triad, I think the bombers are really important in terms of signaling. But for the air leg, I would make the exception, though. I do think that one of the things that we could easily start to phase out are our air-launched cruise missiles, our nuclear-armed air-launched cruise missiles. So countries like the United Kingdom have made a deliberate policy shift to make their nuclear missiles are only ballistic missiles, not cruise missiles, so that there's no mistaking if there's a cruise missile flying at a country, they're not going to think that it may have a nuclear warhead and respond in kind, thus triggering an accidental nuclear exchange or an unintended nuclear exchange. The air-launched cruise missile also runs some of these other risks of miscalculation that we talked about. So countries are, whether we like it or not, different countries around the world and potential adversaries are viewing our investment in refurbishing the air-launched cruise missile, a program called the LRSO here in the United States, or for the long-range standoff option. Countries are viewing that as intended to reduce their own deterrent, potentially. And when you start getting into that territory, then you're risking triggering more arms racing. So I think the bomber leg of our triad is a really important asset, again, especially for signaling purposes, but that we could easily reduce the air leg of the triad by focusing on getting rid of that air-launched cruise missile capability over the coming 15 years or so.
That sounds good. Let me be a bit of the devil's advocate or push back on one thing that you said, Christine. I mean, you've had more experience than anyone else on this panel. But when we were talking about institutions and the problems we've had with low morale and the cheating scandals, I guess my question is this really a fixable problem? Because we have, we've had this for decades now, and it seems structural. It doesn't seem like, we can just simply fix it. I remember Mac Bundy serving in the Kennedy administration, coming here to MIT, and really one of his last lectures here, this is exactly what he focused on. He said, in the military, you get promoted by fighting. You fight in Afghanistan, you fight in Iraq. That's the basis for promotion, not sitting underground looking at a silo that's never used for weapons that are never used. I think at least an argument might be made that this is systemic, and in fact, I think Bundy went on to argue that what we've done is when there were mistakes, we would go and introduce a whole bunch of new regulations and testing, which just put more pressure on the poor servicemen and women who were carrying out these jobs, and as there were more and more tests, they ended up failing more of them, and the morale would sink lower and lower. So, in sum, do you think what could we do differently that we haven't already tried that would actually make a difference here?
It's a great question, and it's a really, really important one. So I would take a little more mixed perspective. I think some of that is inevitable, as you said, and I think for a little bit different reason, though, and it's not the promotion via warfighting sort of take on things. I think some of it is just that other fields within the armed services are increasingly attractive. So A lot of our great young servicemen and women, of course, are working on space and cyber and these things that will be with us. There'll be missions that are supported in perpetuity. They're increasingly important in all kinds of ranges of scenarios across the spectrum of conflict. They have a lot of breadth to them. So in addition to, whether you're physically seated somewhere for too long, there are a lot of different things that you can do to apply the knowledge and the skills that you learn in those fields. And that's really attractive to servicemen and women. So I think that pull, the intellectual pull, is what's going to cause some of the longer inevitable decline. But that's not to say that there aren't things that we can't do. So a lot of the focus in the last 2 years in particular has been focusing on how to take the pressure off these young men and women who are doing these missions. So going back on the notion that testing them more and applying more and more pressure is the way to go, but figure out how to relieve some of that pressure, give them a little bit more time to rest. For example, taking some of the stress off while maintaining really, really high standards is a very, very hard thing to balance, but the department's trying. And I think that there are a lot of ways that we can at least do better as we manage this longer-term transition, that a lot of these young men and women are just going to be simply more interested in doing other things with their careers.
Greg, one of the things that we listed in our principles or attributes, if we were starting from scratch, was a policy or an arsenal that was fiscally responsible. We can't just spend all the money that we want to spend on one thing without it, the opportunity cost, meaning that we don't have money to spend on other things. I know the Center has done a lot of work in this area. Do you have thoughts on that topic?
Yeah. So you're absolutely right. The nuclear arsenal needs to be fiscally responsible, needs to be affordable, because you run the risk of spending so much money to maintain that you don't have money to fulfill your other priorities. The challenge we're running into, it's been considered a budgetary train wreck because we are trying to modernize all these legs of the nuclear triad at the exact same time, and those bills are going to come due, and we're going to max out the credit card. And the real concern there is either A, you can't finish a program that you started and your nuclear arsenal changes because of budgetary constrictions instead of based on the planning you've made. And the other concern is that every dollar you spend on nuclear arsenal is money that you're not spending on your conventional forces or domestic needs. And that means that troops in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, where we're still maintaining occupation forces and still having military operations, might not get the funding they need to complete their objectives. And then that's a real risk, is there's a trade-off between every dollar you spend on nuclear and conventional, and it's a risk that we have to reconsider if we're really thinking about pursuing a large, robust nuclear arsenal that may be too excessive.
Well, that's a great setup for us now, sort of shifting gears a little bit. Andy, as we think about the arsenal we're building and we're supposed to protect us against threats, how do we characterize those threats? I mean, they can't be sort of like empty pictures. The details matter here. As you think about the purpose of the force and the threats we face, what are some of the things that you think about?
Well, the sole purpose of our safe, secure, and effective nuclear arsenal is to deter a nuclear attack on the United States of America and to extend that nuclear umbrella, if you will, to our allies who depend on our nuclear deterrent and they've made the decision not to develop nuclear weapons themselves. So that's the sole purpose. That kind of deterrence works against other states, other countries that have nuclear weapons. It's not something that would deter the suicide bombers or the radical Islamic groups like ISIS that have shown that they're not easily deterrable in the classic sense.
And Erika, when we were having our conversation and talking about attributes that a force might have, I must say one of the ones that we didn't talk about, and I don't know if you have views on this or other things you want to address, we didn't talk about a force that would lend itself to reductions, to fulfilling President Obama's and presidents before him's notion of a world without nuclear weapons. Do you think that's important? How does that play in all this, and how do you see where we're at with the arsenal and where we're going?
Well, absolutely. I think that we need to be thinking about a force that would allow for future reductions, but I think that we are at a point where we can make reductions now, and we don't need to, you know, we have great conventional superiority. We have an excess in the amount of weapons that we have. Even our current policy, you know, says that we do. We just need to have parity with Russia. I think that, you know, we could go a lot lower and we would still be checking the box, the concept of deterrence. And I think, you know, from my point of view, the real threat is the non-state actors and the diffusion of power. And you know, I just don't see rational states jumping to use these weapons if we continue to create the conditions where we have, you know, a nuclear taboo. And as Christine said, we must not, you know, make them more attractive to use, like we, you know, some of the crazy ideas that we had during the Cold War when we had you know, nuclear grenades and things like that. So, yeah.
Well, that sounds good. Let me stay with you and then go back to Andy, because we were, this dovetails nicely, because we were starting to go around the room, as it were, and talk about big ideas or small ideas that we would have for the force structure. So I want to stick with Erika on this and say, okay, you know, tough question here. Given what you just said, what would you change? I mean, what would be the big change that you would recommend?
What would be the big change? You know, I think that we, you know, it's not going to happen tomorrow, but I mean, in thinking about this conversation that we're going to have, I kind of was trying to refine my own thinking. Can we, because of our conventional superiority and because of you know, the moment that we're at right now, where America is still looked to as a leader in the international system, you know, in a number of decades, can we go to zero? And you know, we have the ability to rebuild an arsenal. We know, you know, the nuclear genie's out of the bottle. So, you know, can we? I mean, that would be the boldest. Obviously, that would be the boldest, you know, thing that I could think of. And I kind of see that nuclear weapons are obsolete, and if we stay in this box, in this prism, you know, of believing in deterrence and the ability to, you know, to hold targets at risk, and that somehow creates peace, you know, then we're never ever going to be able to draw down.
Andy, what do you think? You've been in government, you're out of government. Can you offer a big idea here? Again, with the context being that it's Russia and the U.S. who still have 93% of the roughly 16,000 nuclear weapons there are in the world. Is there room for some big thinking, either in the near term or the longer term? What do you think we ought to be doing?
Well, Jim, I'm firmly in the center. I believe in a safe, secure, and effective nuclear deterrent for the United States of America. Indeed, I helped oversee that, and I'm proud of some of the investments that the Obama administration made to reverse decades of neglect in our nuclear arsenal. Now, that said, I think we have some real opportunities looking forward to think more about types of nuclear weapons. There's a lot of focus on numbers, and to think about types in terms of strategic stability. Which types of nuclear weapons are more usable, could blur the line between nuclear and conventional warfare. And Secretary of Defense in the Clinton administration, Bill Perry, and I have written an op-ed piece together, and we've proposed to the administration that perhaps we should focus on nuclear-armed cruise missiles, sea, air, and ground-launched nuclear-armed cruise missiles, and lead the world in a global ban on this particular type of missile system, because we believe that it's among the most destabilizing type of nuclear weapon. And why do we say that? Well, quite simply, they're launched without warning, and because they come in two flavors, with a nuclear warhead and with a conventional warhead, it's impossible to discriminate. If one is flying towards your country, you have no way of knowing in those few minutes you have whether it has a nuclear warhead on board or if it's just a conventional attack. And this could risk even accidental nuclear warfare that could escalate quickly out of control into a full-scale nuclear war. So we would like President Obama in his last year to challenge the world, to make an example and challenge the world to work together, all the nuclear weapons possessors, to either forego or eliminate this particular dangerous class of nuclear weapons.
Terrific. That's a big idea. What do you say, Greg? You previewed it a little earlier in the conversation, but where would you like to go?
Big idea. I think I'd like to get away from this thinking that every nuclear weapon, the numerical value is the most important thing. I'd like to focus more on strategic stability in a more broad sense. So that's looking at the nuclear arsenal, but not just how many weapons we have, but variety and flexibility we have of the delivery systems, looking at the fact that we have command and control, the fact that we have intelligence, looking at conventional weapons, looking at economic deterrence, and taking that entire approach to look at strategic stability instead of what we often see sometimes in the halls of Congress, which is, does Russia have one more nuclear weapon than we do, and does that mean we're all going to die? I think if you can boil it down and look at strategic stability and deterrence in more of a comprehensive sense, the nuclear weapons fall a little more comfortably into place, and we recognize, for every dollar spent on nuclear, you're not spending on conventional. It helps kind of make those trade-offs a little more clear if you look at the broad picture. So that's what I'd like to see in terms of big ideas, is looking at a more broad deterrence as opposed to just how many nuclear weapons do we have point blank.
Sounds terrific. Let me get in on this and offer my own weak tea here of ideas. I'm prepared to say we should get rid of the land-based missiles. All right. Do they add something? Sure. But that may be canceled out by the vulnerabilities they have. But let's say it was in the net. Yes, they add to our security and they detract from our security, and it's comes out in balance. I'd still get rid of them. I see no justification for them. As I say, I think these institutional problems are systemic. I have not heard anyone say anything that convinces me that the ongoing morale and institutional problems that have racked the management of land-based missiles is fixable. And if it was fixable, why the heck haven't we been able to do it for all the decades we've been trying to? So I see dangers there. I don't see a lot of payoff. I think if we're stuck where we have to go in some religious trilogy of we have to have some of each of the three kinds, I don't see how that makes much sense for security or conceptually. So at some point we're going to have to make some hard decisions, and I think one of the hard decisions here is get rid of the land-based missiles. Let me offer another idea that is completely wacky that I only considered as of several days ago. And I'm sure my friends who have spent time in government will be able to show me the error of my ways here. Part of what we're doing when we're calculating what our total force is going to be is saying how much we need as an independent nation to deal with Russia, for example. But the truth of the matter is France and Britain have nuclear weapons too. And in fact, we are in treaty obligation with NATO that we will trade London for New York or Paris for Washington. We're saying we will assure your survival by using our nuclear weapons to protect you. But when it comes time to counting their nuclear weapons in our pile, as it were, for our force requirements, we all say, no, this is a national force and we can't really do that. And I think it's time to end that myth. And we can't, there's an old idea in the past called nuclear sharing. Now, and in some ways, it was a terrible idea at the time in the 1950s. As I think about it again, it seems a little more attractive, but the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, Article 1, is pretty clear that we cannot share our nuclear weapons. But it seems to me we could at least begin to factor in the fact that our friends have nuclear weapons aimed at the same places we do, and that should give us a little more freedom of movement as we consider the size and structure of our own arsenal. So those are two wacky ideas I will put out there. Now that we've heard some good ideas, I'm wondering if we can transition to talk about how to get there. We started.
Hey, Jim, can I just add one thing here? There's, I'd just be curious if people had any reaction to some of those big ideas. And in fact, I think Christine wanted to build on, actually riff off one of your ideas. So why don't we go to Christine before we move on to how to get to these things? Because there is a lot. These are big ideas. Is anyone? What do they think about them? Is there anybody who want to build on them? Want to push back on them? Be interesting to hear.
Sure.
Christine, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think it's great to talk about all of them. I guess mine was a little more of a segue. I was going to build on what Jim had just said in terms of considering other countries' forces alongside ours. I think we do that in a lot of ways. It may not be as robust as we should, but I would take it in a slightly different direction, and I think it's really important that we move away from our focus on just nuclear capabilities in these conversations. So when I talk to a lot of our treaty allies that we're bound in these relationships with, I hear a lot of frustration that, as we walk through different security scenarios and different things that might happen in our security environment and how we might react, that some of the U.S. thinking is to immediately go to, how will we use nuclear weapons in this scenario? How would we move them? How would we signal with them? How might we actually use them? And it very quickly slides into a conversation where we're using nuclear weapons and trying to figure out how to control escalation, which most everybody, including the leaders of the Department of Defense, say is not possible to do if you're in a nuclear warfighting scenario. I would open it up beyond the nuclear capabilities. I don't think that it's just a game of saying how many nukes do we all have and where are they and how we put them together. I think it's what's the security threat we're facing and how do we go at it, and how can we handle it conventionally and through diplomacy and through talking and through other stabilizing measures that mean that we never have to get to the point where we're actually bringing the nuclear weapons into the conversation. I think that's a mental shift and a shift in how we practice talking about these things with our close allies that's really important in terms of getting there.
Terrific. Anyone else want to get on this? Greg, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I'd chirp in. I enjoyed what Andy said about the LRSO and
what is that again?
Sorry, the long range. My boss will kill me. The long range standoff weapon. It's the nuclear cruise missile. We had an old one. We're looking at potentially building a new one. It cost us about $30 billion in total. Not only in not making that could you save that money and use it on other things, but we have other capabilities to fill that role. We have the B-61, which is a gravity bomb that's dropped from bombers. So you still have the bomber leg. In addition, we have air-launched cruise missiles that are conventional that we could use to hit targets from a standoff position outside of airspace. So we're keeping our pilots safe in that regard, but we're not at risk of giving up the nuclear option. And on your point, Jim, with the ICBM, one of the things that removing the ICBM does is it takes the launch on warning away from the decision makers, that we don't have to make this 2-3 minute decision as to whether or not we want to end the world on a Tuesday. So if you remove that need to launch immediately because the ICBM is no longer part of the arsenal, and that's how you defeat a vulnerable object, you get the chance to make a little more rational decision making when it comes to nuclear scenarios.
Let me unpleasantly push this and see, is there anyone else here that wants to make a spirited defense of why land-based missiles are crucial to our continued deterrent posture? Any takers on that one? Good.
I'm not going to make a spirited defense of them per se, maybe play devil's advocate. One of the most important things to think about is that we have our own sort of internal analysis in the United States of this, but what really matters a lot in our equations regarding the nuclear forces is what other countries think about them. This is why it's not an either-or proposition. I think we need to have serious discussions about the air-launched cruise missile and the ICBM force. and push those conversations and advance them in a very serious way. But in terms of international perception, the cruise missile, the nuclear-armed cruise missile, is seen as essentially coming into another country's territory and coming directly at them in a way that the land-based force is just not. A lot of, like it or not, a lot of international players think of the land-based options as sitting there to take blows from, you know, if another country is going to nuke us, that they'll essentially be targets, or, you know, we may use them in an actual extreme nuclear warfare type of scenario. But they don't see them as being an offensive or first strike weapon. There's a risk with the cruise missile, though, that countries are perceiving it as essentially being intended to conduct a first strike on them. And I think that's extraordinarily dangerous, and that's why again, it's not a competition. We should have serious conversations about both. But if I had to prioritize one, I would focus on discontinuing our building of a new nuclear-armed cruise missile and preserving the land-based option a little bit longer while we take a longer tail for the eventual reductions in that.
Let me put Andy and Erika on the spot here. Reactions to what we've just been saying about land-based. Obviously, Andy, you've already made your views clear about cruise missiles, and I am in complete agreement with you on that. Any defense of ICBMs you want to offer? I think you're on mute.
Jim, for me, it's a matter of sequencing, of timing. And our recommendation to President Obama is focused on what can he achieve in the next 12 months. He has 1 year left. What is a Nobel-worthy move that he can make now at no risk to our deterrent? And we've come upon this issue of announcing a decision not to replace the current air-launched cruise missile with a new nuclear-armed cruise missile. We could do that and have not the slightest negative impact on our deterrent. Taking a longer-term view beyond the Obama administration into future administrations, I do agree that we should take a hard look at the land-based nuclear weapons, the ICBMs, and consider the possibility of working in tandem with other countries, but working towards what's called a dyad, having the submarine-based ballistic missiles and the air leg, the bomber leg of our triad. But that's not something that we want to do quickly. It's not something that we wouldn't want to consult very closely with our allies on, and it's not something that we would want to do unilaterally. It would be something that we should consider in a discussion with the other nuclear weapons possessors around the world.
Erika, thoughts on this topic?
Sure. So I think I'll just add the devil's advocate position on the land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles. If we're thinking about what's the scariest scenario to consider, and how do you deter your adversary, I think it's pretty scary to think that when some country is that these weapons are so easy to launch and you are making a decision very quickly, and the only way to avoid their destruction is by launching them back. In that way, I think it's kind of like the traditional concept of mutual assured destruction, and I think that you can make a good argument for why you would need to keep those land-based missiles and how they serve as an important deterrent in the triad.
All right. Well, we've got some pretty good ideas, a mix of different ideas, and some of which seem to have fairly robust support in the room. Others less so. So what have I heard? I've heard people talk about strengthening conventional deterrence. I've heard about announcing a policy that we would not deploy nuclear cruise missiles. I've heard Christine talked about the importance of myth busting. I said get rid of the damn ICBMs and include our partners in our calculations. All of these changes, big and small, will be a fight, right? We don't have the triad by accident. We got here because of a long political process with institutional politics and electoral politics, and this is where we're at, and it's always hard to change the system. Now, we started with the clean slate. We sort of said, let's ignore all that and think about, where we need to be, where we want to be. Well, let's get back to that ugly real world that we so blessedly left for a few moments and say, we want to do these things. We want to, in some cases, get rid of ICBMs or prohibit nuclear-tipped cruise missiles or some of the other proposals that we've had. How do we do that? Within the bureaucratic and political context that we have, what are the sorts of beliefs that people are going to have to acquire, change in ways of looking at things? What are the changes institutionally or politically? Is there a way to create incentives so that folks who are currently in favor of a particular nuclear posture see it as in their interest in adopting a different nuclear posture? I'm reminded of the role of atomic energy organizations early in the nuclear age, prior to the NPT. These were institutions that, from a bureaucratic politics perspective, tended to favor nuclear weapons programs in their little countries spread out across the world. Why? Because absent a nuclear project, they were going out of business. And so there were good reasons for budget and the sorts of things we normally associate with bureaucratic politics for those nuclear institutions to support nuclear weapons programs. But the NPT completely changed those incentives upside down, because it said, if you join, you get all the peaceful uses nuclear technology you want, and if you don't join, we're shutting you out. And a lot of those nuclear bureaucracies flipped their vote and suddenly became supporters of nonproliferation rather than supporters of bomb programs. I mean that only as a metaphor. If we're going to take on the politics to try to get some of these shorter term or longer term changes we want, how do we get folks on our side? How do we convince them it's in their political or bureaucratic interest to go down this path rather than sticking with the status quo? I know that's a big, hard question, so I'm going to ask all of you. Maybe I should ask the policy folks who've been in there. You've left because you've probably gotten beaten up at too many interagency meetings, but Andy, based on your experience, what are the things we can do to try to create possibilities for change?
Well, there are two things. In looking through the history of nuclear weapons in our country, whenever a change occurs, it's when the president himself makes that decision and makes those changes. They never bubble up through the bureaucracy. So this is a case where they really are the president's weapons. And so those decisions need to be made at the top, and Ronald Reagan did this. George Herbert Walker Bush did this in 1991 with the presidential nuclear initiatives. So I'm a firm believer in strong presidential leadership in the area of nuclear weapons, especially to overcome what you so well described as bureaucratic inertia. And the other important piece of this is the public has a stake. And we need to have a discussion. We need to create awareness. That's why a dialogue like we're having today, thanks to Reinvent, it's so important, because most people, especially the younger generation, they think this is something of the past, that nuclear weapons are really no longer even around or an issue. And we need to, with the presidential election year, we need to raise the visibility of these issues so people will take a view, will become involved, and that's how we're going to change this.
Terrific. But let's consult our other insider, who no doubt has had her share of tough meetings. with colleagues from other agencies. What do you think, Christine? How do we push this rock?
Oh, well, first of all, the bureaucracy is a blast. So, not to malign it. No, it's full of people who are there doing really, really great work and doing their jobs. They're stuck within bureaucratic processes, though, that perpetuate the status quo. So that's why, as Andy said, what you need is change from the president and from Congress. It's not going to come bottom up. It's not going to come from within those bureaucracies. They're just not designed or oriented toward generating creative ideas to create radical change. So we need to focus on our leadership. In addition to elevating the public conversation in the U.S. that Andy said, which I totally agree with, I think one thing that's really compelling to both our heads of state and our congressional leaders is getting international voices into the picture. And this is not bringing international nuclear experts, but security experts. If you talk to security experts and political and regional experts from all over the world, especially from our closest allies whose voices are so important to our policies and how we design them and how we think about them, they're not, what you hear from them, what they're worried about is the hybridization of warfare. They're worried about A2AD scenarios. They're worried about...
What's that acronym again?
Oh, I'm sorry, access. They're worried about being denied access to cyber and space domains and other things that prohibit our ability to operate freely in other environments around the world. They're worried about what anybody who reads a newspaper sees as the security threats around the world: ISIS, terrorism, migration, transnational trafficking, climate change. We need all of the political leaders and security experts from around the world that know that nuclear weapons are not the fix for a lot of our greatest security challenges, to bring their voices back to the United States more. And that's really incumbent on those of us in Washington who can bring those voices and make them more prominent and make sure that congressional leaders understand that what they're voting for is not a solution to the modern security threats that we're trying to face around the world.
Well, that's true. Two dynamite statements to start off. Presidential leadership. This is not something the bureaucracy is going to solve left to its own. And our international partners, who we are tied to and whom we are also trying to protect. Terrific. Gregg, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, to piggyback a little bit off what Andy said, you need a groundswell of support from the constituencies in the United States in order to actually enact some political change. The challenge there is that millennials don't think of nuclear weapons as a realistic concern right now. For instance, when I left policy school to come to the nuclear field, I said I'm working on nuclear weapons policy. They said, we still have those? My friends had no idea. And people think, oh, maybe we have 500, 100. They don't realize we have 5,000. And they don't realize that nuclear terrorism is still a real concern and that there's material that's not being secured. And part of it is our role at both in government and in the policy field to get those messages across. I think when people realize that this is an existential threat and that this is maybe the biggest threat to human life we have, I think that can motivate a lot of political change. And only through that kind of groundswell of support are you going to see actual, tangible pushes to actually change some of the bureaucracy that holds the institutional inertia we currently have.
Erika, want to weigh in on this?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. So we also know that there are entrenched interests in Congress. You have the ICBM caucus, the states that have the ICBM silos, North Dakota, Wyoming, Montana. So you have states that have a lot of weapons producers in their districts or in their states, and so we also have to sort of, and this is true across the board, not just among nuclear weapons production, we have to somehow create incentives for these members of Congress to kind of change their tune. I mean, I do think it's somewhat ironic that the states, the senators that have ICBMs in their states and are the most vulnerable to an attack are the ones, that are that have the most stake in keeping them there, because they are somewhat of an economic driver in their states. So how do we make sure, how do we provide new economic opportunities that are not coming from the Department of Defense and from weapons producers.
That's terrific. You know, to add in my 2 cents, I think all of you, or many of you, are absolutely right. There is no real consciousness, particularly among young people, but really young and old alike, that we have as many nuclear weapons as we have, and that the dangers we face are not only from our enemies who have them, but the weapons themselves. And I think that's one of the unintended consequences of the end of the Cold War. If you go back and you look at early nuclear history, when you had the ban the bomb movement and other, and testing and all the rest, there was a real sense among the American people that these weapons were inherently dangerous. And while we had to have them to stop the Soviets, we nevertheless, like the person who keeps a gun in their house, were facing additional risks, paying for that security with new risks by having these dangerous weapons, who won't care whether you're an American or a Soviet when they go off, and won't care whether it was accidentally or for good reason. And I think what happened was, after the end of the Cold War, our focus went from nuclear weapons to proliferation. And what's proliferation? Proliferation is all those other guys that have nuclear weapons, right? We forgot that we have them. We forgot the dangers they pose to ourselves, and the focus became exclusively on these other folks, the North Koreans, the Iranians, whatever. And I think that's really undermined our ability to make change, but it's also lulled people into thinking that the weapons aren't there anymore. I remember, and I'm probably misremembering, that there was polling done right after the end of the Cold War. This would have been the early 90s, where people in polls expressed the view that we had gotten rid of these nuclear weapons. And if they thought that then, you can only imagine what a young person growing up, never having studied or thought about this before, they would, understandably assume that we had already done something about it. So how do we get at that? How do we get at beliefs? I know folks have argued that we should focus on economic cost, and I think that's important. But I actually think, and this is something where the ICBMs are helpful, I think if people begin to appreciate, whether it's because of a scandal or an accident or something else, that these weapons that are sitting on our territory are dangerous to ourselves, and that they are there, and that they pose a danger, and that we have to balance the dangers they pose against the dangers that our adversaries pose. So I think part of it is attitudinal. I think most social change happens, not all social change, but a lot of it happens because of external shocks. You know, the bureaucracy doesn't want to do anything. No one wants to do anything. No one wants to take a political risk. People will offer you 100 arguments why you shouldn't do something, and then something terrible happens, and then those arguments disappear. And then the only question in people's minds is, what are we going to do about this terrible thing? This earthquake, this disease outbreak, this whatever. And I think that applies here. It seems inconceivable to me that over the next several decades, India and Pakistan will not have an accident of some kind, or there won't be an accident in Russia, or a sub that sinks to the bottom of the ocean. And so I think as we think about opportunities for change, we need to keep in mind that those opportunities, those windows will be widest when there is something that happens in the external environment that changes the conversation from not is doing this good or bad, but why haven't we done it before? And if we're going to be successful when those opportunities come, then we need to be able to do the due diligence and begin to build institutions that will give people the confidence that they can make that transition to a different place. We don't want to have an accident happen, everyone throw up their hands and say, oh my God, we've got to do something, and then the other person say, well, we'd like to, but we have no capacity to do that. We're locked in. So I think it's for those who can't, who do have the luxury of focusing on these issues every day at their jobs, part of our responsibility is begin to think about the institutions we need to build that would allow those transitions when the political opportunity presents itself, which will probably be after a tragic, awful, event. And then finally, I want to underline what Erika said. I'm a big believer in incentives. I mean, coercion can work. It can get you somewhere, but it's way easier to get change when people buy into it and have alternatives. And so I think it's not enough to lecture the folks in North Dakota or lecture the people who disagree with us. We have to be able to go to them and say, if we make this decision, you benefit. This is what you get out of it. Frankly, in my own view, that's why the labs, the National Weapons Labs, supported the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, because they got something out of it. Some members of Congress supported the New START Treaty because they were promised modernization, whatever that means. But you got to be able to, if you want people to get off the base, then you got to give them a reason for doing so, and they have to see themselves as coming out ahead, not losing. So those are some of the thoughts that come to my mind, as we think about where we want to go. Reactions to any of that before? I think we're soon on our glide path. Speaking of glide paths, soon on the glide path to wrapping up this conversation and going to each of us for some takeaways. But let me pause in case people have violent reactions to anything that I've said or that others have said. No violence? No? Okay. I'll take that. I'll take silence as endorsement. Complete and unfettered endorsement. Andy, do you want any piece of that? No? All right. Well, this is a chance we're quickly approaching our 3:30 mark, and this has been an incredibly rich conversation, and there's no way that we can attempt to summarize it. But I'd like to go around to each of you, maybe starting with Gregg, and ask you what are some of your takeaways. What are particularly things that other people have said that have given you pause, but maybe even things that they've said that help you think about your own ideas in a different way. And I continue to offer this long introduction, hoping to give Gregg time to compose his thoughts, since I'm calling on him first. Gregg?
Yes, I have all the thoughts. Thank you, Jim. First, I'd like to echo the point you made, that we're better off trying to address these issues before the system breaks than trying to clean it up after it does so. And there's a sense of urgency that's wrapped around the nuclear issue that is hard to get away from, and I think that in and of itself can inspire a new constituency to get involved. What that means is that we have to convey those ideas. To the person out there who's worried about these issues but doesn't work in the field and doesn't know what they can do, your vote matters, because your members of Congress vote on how much money goes into these programs. They vote on how much money we spend on nuclear weapons versus countering nuclear terrorism. So if you write a letter to your member of Congress, you send a tweet, you do a town hall meeting, you mention nuclear weapons are scary to me, I'm concerned about the existential threats to the humanity, what are you doing to make things better? That can actually play a huge role. It puts it on their radar, and it helps us to leverage that as well. So I'd say that the person who makes their heard can actually make a difference.
Helpful, very helpful, and helpful particularly because it gives people something concrete that actually something concrete to do that actually matters. And Gregg, you cleaned up my mistakes, because I should have said, not only as we take a few minutes each and talk about what has struck us about this conversation, but there is this important question of what it is you want the audience to take away from this. If they're going to remember one or two things, what are those? What should they remember? And Gregg, that's a great way to lead off. Christine, can I put you on the spot next, and maybe Eric after that? I mean, Andy after that?
Sure, Jim, thanks. I'd echo most of what you said, except I don't want a catastrophic accident or incident to happen to cause us to have to make more change on this front. That's a really, really devastating thought. So I hope that we can actually do a lot without having to get there in order to prompt our action. Sometimes devastation is required to catalyze action, but I really hope that we don't have to go in that direction. There's so many good ideas that have come out just from this very short dialogue that I think that we could lean into, and hopefully we're reaching a broader audience that can help elevate that conversation and perpetuate those ideas. It's not a domestic politics one, but in terms of, you mentioned trying to make sure that we have the institutions and the mechanisms in place when reductions are made in the future to make sure that the transition's smooth, and that it's not just an overnight, very sudden thing. I think we have to game it out with all of our allies. I think we should sit down, and even some potential adversaries. You know, if you could do it as an academic exercise with China or with India and Pakistan outside of government circles, we should sit down and think about all of the changes that might come in our force structure and sit down with those countries and say, what does this mean for regional stability? What does this mean for your security? What does this mean for how we work together? And I think that that's a really fruitful way to get a lot of good ideas. So the answer isn't all negative. And I have a lot of those conversations. What you get are good ideas for all of the positive benefits that would come of making these reductions. And that can help make the case domestically, but it can also make sure that we're ready to walk hand in hand with our closest partners internationally and make sure that these reductions are done in ways that are stabilizing and measured and very carefully thought through. So I'm a big fan of gaming it all out.
Excellent. Andy, I think you're on mute there.
Yeah, one of my mentors, Senator Sam Nunn, he likes to portray President Obama's vision, Ronald Reagan's vision of a world without nuclear weapons, as the summit of Mount Everest. And it's clouded in, and you can't see the summit, and you're not sure how to get there. But the way we get to the top of Everest is we establish base camps along the way. And I think a really practical, feasible, attainable next base camp on that long road to a world without nuclear weapons is this idea of a global ban on these particularly destabilizing nuclear-armed cruise missiles. If we can get other countries who have them to agree to get rid of them, if we can make a decision not to modernize and replace ours with a new nuclear weapons system called the LRSO and let the current one age out in 15 years or less if we can negotiate an end to them, and then get countries that haven't developed them agree to forego them, I think that would be a really meaningful in terms of reducing the risk of use of nuclear weapons, improving strategic stability in the world. That would be a real achievement to establish that as the next base camp on this admittedly much longer climb to a world without nuclear weapons.
Erika.
Yes. Okay, I'm unmuted now. So I think the thing that I want to hammer home is just the thing that we kind of started out talking about, which is the fact that we are at this decision point, and our country is about to spend $1 trillion or more re-upping our nuclear arsenal, and I think that really needs to seep in. There are estimates out there from the Department of Defense that could eat up 10% of our defense budget moving forward when the peaks, when the production is at its peak, and it's an affordability issue, and I think it's a way for people to really understand, if you can tie in the cost factor with, with the fact that these weapons, tend to be, an existential threat to humanity, you kind of stop and think, is this really what's going to keep America safe and stable, over the next 100 years or so? I think most people are going to disagree. The question, on my mind always is, how do we get folks to chime in, to be involved, and to make this at the top of their bucket list of things that they care about? And for me, that really does it can come back to the enormous cost and the opportunity costs therein. So I do want to thank you all for this wonderful conversation, and I was really happy to be a part of it.
Yeah, let me conclude with some thoughts and start there. It's been an incredibly rich conversation. We've talked about things, decisions we're confronting, as Erika said, right now, decisions about the nuclear weapons arsenal that will have follow-on implications for decades to come. So we've got some homework and some work to do right now, as well as things we want to accomplish in the future as those base camps are being built. And I think that we've heard all sorts of good recommendations. I mean, picking up on Gregg and tweeting, I hope people who are viewing this live or later or listening to a podcast will take the advantage and tweet the link out and post it to their Facebook page and engage their communities on a community of friends on these issues. You know, I think one of the big eye-openers for me certainly was Christine talking about the role of our friends and allies, that they can be a useful and helpful part of this conversation. And that's something, because I get all narrow-minded, I think I forget that. And I think that's really fundamentally important, both because of the politics, but also because of creating a political community that can advance that. Excuse me. Sure. Finally, now I'm coughing. You know, and I could not agree more with Andy that we need to step up to the plate and do something about nuclear-tipped cruise missiles before that horse is out of the barn. We don't want to wait and then have it be something that is much harder to deal with later on. I should also add that in no way am I endorsing a nuclear accident. Finally, I would say, you know, the opportunities present themselves to viewers right now. We're in the middle of a presidential election. I think Andy's point about presidential leadership being crucial, that you can't leave it to the bureaucracies themselves. So in this election season, we should be asking candidates, Democratic and Republican alike, what their views are and what they plan to do about it, and challenging them to explain why they think the choices they're making will make us safer. So I think there's a lot here to do. I know I've learned a lot. I come away with this with a whole new set of things on my things to do list. And I want to thank Reinvent, and am honored to have been with this knowledgeable and accomplished panel. Peter?
Thank you. And thank you, Jim. Really, terrific conversation. There's no way we could have done this without your expertise and also the expertise in this panel. And I do think it's an issue of getting more Americans to understand this, and that's partly what we're trying to do here. Open this conversation up. It'll be available to anybody from now on, and we'll also be doing shorter pieces that'll be easily spread through the web. And actually, we encourage you to spread those as well. So thank you, everyone. And also, remember, we just started, all this will be on podcast, so you can listen to it on your commute or your jog or however you think about that. So thank you all, and this has really been a great conversation. Thank you.